been a hot minute since I've recorded a video. Flipping hell. So this video was requested by, I'm sorry if I pronounce your names wrong, I have written them down, Edexcel, Henry and Shrishti Belki. I'm sorry if I pronounce them wrong, because I probably have. But this is going to be the whole of component 2 AS Politics for Edexcel, in as quick as I can get it done. I did notice, as I was rewatching the last video to revise, that I speak very quickly. So I'm going to see if I can slow it down a little bit, and if I'm still going too quick, you can sort of change the speed on YouTube. So, right, okay, let's, because that's, there we go. Oh look, you can see baby pictures. No, we don't want that. Ah! Also, I don't know how to edit, so if anyone has any sort of free editing programs that they would recommend, because I'm broke. Right, okay, so where are we going to start? So this is component 2 for AS Politics, but also the first half of paper 2 for A-level politics, if that makes sense. Right, so we're going to start with the Constitution. So the purposes of the Constitution. Number 1 is establishing unifying values and goals. So this is where the Constitution lays out defining values and priorities of society. Number 2 is empowering the state, so providing framework to limit government power, but also to lay out the powers it does have. Number 3 is to protect freedoms, so define the scope of civil liberties and theoretically prevent the state from encroaching on them. Number 4 is government stability, so it formulates and regulates the relationships between the state institutions and the citizens. And number 5 is to legitimise regimes, so outwardly and in the international community, and inwardly through building respect for the Constitution. So in liberal democracies, constitutional theory asserts that it acts as protection for citizens against arbitrary power, and so they check the state's ability to exercise power. So, if we look at codified versus uncodified, this is again something that, because I'm doing US politics as well, so US is codified. Right, so codified means only one document. It's used in most countries. It is a higher form of law, which means, it has sovereignty over everything else. It is entrenched, so it's hard to amend. There is a specific method to change it. It means your rights are protected, and judges have the power to determine what is or isn't constitutional. So versus uncodified, which uses a variety of sources, which we'll talk about in a second. A very limited number of countries, but the UK is one of them. It is not a higher form of law, so it stands on the same platform as, things like the judiciary, the executive and the legislative, I have to think then. It is unentrenched, that means it's nice and easy to change. In fact, Parliament can change it. Rights are not guaranteed, however, and limited judicial power to interpret what is or isn't constitutional. So, in terms of the sources of the UK Constitution, there are essentially 5 of them. You have statute law, common law, conventions, EU law and treaties, and authoritative works. And I'm going to be giving some examples of these now. So we'll start with statute law. So this is basically any act of Parliament. So these are the things like the Great Reform Act of 1832, which extended the franchise, the Scotland Act of 1998, which granted some devolution powers to Scotland, the European Communities Act of 1972, which incorporated the Treaty of Rome into UK law, Fixed Term Parliaments Act of 2011, which meant there were fixed 5-yearly elections, 5-yearly, and the Human Rights Act of 1998. Now, not all acts of Parliament are constitutional, so things like the Dangerous Dogs Act of 1991, that's not a constitutional one, but it's wibbly wobbly tiny whiny stuff. Right, common law. So, senior judges in the UK's higher courts can use their powers of judicial review to clarify and establish a legal position where statute law is unclear. So if there's something that's a bit judges can make common law in order to clear that up. So things like the royal prerogative is an example of common law. So this is basically powers that the Queen should have, but in reality the Prime Minister has. So things like declaring war and negotiating treaties, generally things that the Prime Minister now does, but she still has some power, for example choosing the PM or essentially putting her royal stamp on it. So the next one is conventions. So these are not considered to be binding, so the monarch by convention must give their assent to Acts of Parliament. So Gordon Brown announced that the UK would not declare war without a parliamentary vote, which shows that new conventions can be established. So EU law and treaties, let's not talk about Brexit at the moment because that's a bit of a... The UK became a member of the European Economic Community in 1973. We have the Treaty of Rome in 1958, and obviously the ECHR, yada yada. So the biggest one, and I think the hardest one to remember, is authoritative works. So these are essentially documents that hold a lot of power in our constitution and set out things. So these will be the work of A.D. Dicey, An Introduction to the Study of the Law of the Constitution of 1883, which focused on parliamentary sovereignty. Erskine May, A Treatise of the Law, Privileges, Proceedings and Usage of Parliament in 1844. And Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution, which was released in 1867, which sets out the role of the PM and the Cabinet. Right, so let's talk about the pillars of the UK Constitution. So number one is parliamentary sovereignty, very important. So there is no single authoritative document because the Constitution isn't codified, and that means we need somewhere to place all of the authority, therefore Parliament has to be sovereign. So the Westminster Parliament is the supreme lawmaking body, so Parliament can legislate on any subject of its choosing. Legislation can be overturned by any higher authority, and no Parliament can bind its successors. That one is also super important. But referendums get in the way of this a bit. So they transfer a degree of legislative power back to the people and away from Parliament, but they're not actually legally binding. So how meaningful is it really? So next one, number two, is the rule of law. So we are all equal under the law and everyone must obey the law. So the government itself is subject to laws and can't exceed them, which is important because otherwise they would have all of the power and it can be used not nicely. Citizens can also take government or local authority to court if they feel they have been treated improperly. The courts can hold everyone to account. Laws have to be interpreted and judged by an independent judiciary, free of political interference. And we are all entitled to a fair trial if accused of crime. Number three is parliamentary government under a constitutional monarchy. So, government ministers are accountable to Parliament because they are drawn from it. Drawn from and accountable to. Remember that phrase. So, Parliament is sovereign, and you have to be an MP to be in government. It's a fusion of powers, really. I'm going to add a bit of US in here. That's unlike the US, where you have to essentially stop whatever job you already had in order to be the president. So the Constitution is not entrenched. So each new Parliament can amend the Constitution. Power can only be exceeded by the government with approval of Parliament, and Parliament can amend the Constitution by an Act of Parliament. And finally, the last pillar, the fourth one, is a unitary state. So regional government may be weak or non-existent, they don't have a lot of power, and local government has very little power. And that's because legal sovereignty lies within the UK Parliament. Sometimes it may transfer power elsewhere, so devolution to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. But this is not a transfer of sovereignty, it's only a transfer of power. So now we're going to talk about reforms, and we're going to start with New Labour. So New Labour focused on essentially four things. Number one, modernisation. Number two, decentralisation. Number three, democratisation. That's a blimmin' hard word to say, i.e. democracy. And number four, rights. So we look at modernisation first. We look at the House of Lords reform, which was sort of 1997 to 2007-ish. And that's the removal of hereditary peers. So in terms of democracy and democratisation is electoral reforms. So proportional representation is introduced to the UK, so we have different election systems in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and also different ones for mayoral elections and things like that. So devolution, very much linked to that one. So it's decentralisation of power, not sovereignty, to places like Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And the Human Rights Act of 1998, there's a big one for rights. So now if we look at 2010 to 2015, the coalition reforms. So they're normally known as constitutional traditionalists because the constitution works well for them. Why would you change something that actually benefits you? But there was constitutional reform because of the coalition with the Lib Dems. So, very obviously, we have the Fixed Term Parliaments Act of 2011, elections every 5 years. We also have the Scotland Act of 2012, which was devolution, which, interestingly, is something the Conservatives were originally against. We have the House of Lords Reform Act of 2014, which says that laws can be removed for serious criminal offences or non-attendance. My voice, my God. And the Wales Act of 2014 as well. Okay, so I just had a drink break, so hopefully my voice will be a bit better now. So now we move on to reforms since 2015. Now, when I wrote these notes, it was last academic year, so some of this stuff, you know, there may be some new things in there that I'm not including, sorry. So the first one is the Wales Act of 2017, which gave the Welsh Assembly tax raising powers. We also have EVEL, if you don't know what that means, it's English Votes for English Laws. So you got the 2013 Mackay Commission, used for the first time in January 2018 for Housing and Planning Bill. And the Scotland Act of 2016, which was much more devolution, including things like setting tax rates and thresholds for income tax, Crown Estate, but I spelled estate wrong, and areas of equal opportunities policy. So, in terms of the codified constitution, should the UK have one? Well, yes. Let's look at the yes stuff first. So it's logical after recent reforms to change to a codified constitution. It is an authoritative reference point for courts. It sets limits on the power of the state. It's greater protection of citizens' rights and will better inform citizens of the values and workings of the political system. But pragmatic adaptation has worked well so far. There is no agreed process of it. There is no consensus on what it should include. It is rigid and difficult to amend. It gives power to judges even more, and they're unaccountable because they're unelected. And other issues, Brexit, are more important at the moment. So let's look at devolution, everyone's favourite topic. So I'm going to cover Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and a bit on England, sort of relatively briefly. So, the Scottish Parliament was created by the Scotland Act in 1998. There are 129 MSPs and the SNP have had power since 2007. So in terms of tax, we have income rates, stamp duty and air passenger duty. In terms of environment, we have housing, local government and transport. In terms of law and home affairs, they're in charge of prisons and elections. In terms of health and social policy, they're in charge of things like abortion and the health service and education. They have things like tourism, sport, culture and language. Also, it's free university tuition if you live in Scotland. I don't live in Scotland, I wish I did. 2014 independence thing was 55 to 45 remain, so what can you do? Wales. So the Welsh Assembly was created by the Wales Act in 1998. It has 60 members, and the Welsh government was created in 2014 officially. So there are things like the environment, so they have control over local government, housing, transport, sport, tourism, culture and language, elections, stamp duty, Welsh rate of income tax, landfill tax, social services, health service, yada yada. And interestingly, the 1979 referendum overwhelmingly refused devolution. So a bit of a change in culture, I would think. So in terms of Northern Ireland, we have obviously the Good Friday Agreement. Very important. Very important, that. So the Northern Ireland Assembly has 108 members. In 2016, Sinn Féin withdrew support. It has control over, let's see, health service and welfare benefits, social services, elections, justice, police prisons. Police prisons? I think that's supposed to be police and prisons. Tourism, sport, culture and language, corporation tax, yada yada. And power has to be shared by both communities. Because there's the whole... I'm not going to go into Irish history, let's not do that. England. So, like I've already mentioned, we've got English votes for English laws. So should there be special procedures for the House of Commons when dealing with things that only affect England, considering that the other countries have the power to do things without the influence of other countries, if that makes sense. I explained that terribly. So, we treat the UK Parliament like it's an English Parliament, so therefore it could make sense to create a whole English Parliament itself, but England is bigger than other countries and it may sort of break up the UK a bit. Probably not a good idea at the moment with Brexit. So we also have the West Lothian question, so Scottish MPs can vote on English issues in the UK government, but we can't vote on purely Scottish issues. 74, no, not 74, what am I on about? 78% voted no in a 2004 referendum for devolution to Northern England. Not North East England even. So now we have some pretty basic things. Let's talk about the differences between the House of Commons and House of Lords. So the House of Commons is elected, which is arguably more legitimate. However, there is a question of the first past the post system. I do lots of rants on the first past the post system, which you guys probably don't know about, but it's one of my biggest pet peeves. It's questionable as it doesn't have proportional vote share, seat share, the whole idea of just no. So there are 650 MPs which are fixed unless the boundaries change. Includes things like backbenches. Government holds the majority most of the time. It has stronger legislative power than the House of Lords, and also has things like the Westminster Hall, where things get scrutinised a lot deeper than we may see on things like the House of Commons. So the House of Lords is appointed, which is arguably making them less legitimate. So they are limited to 92 hereditary peers, thank God. And government does not hold the majority because there are lots of independents and crossbenchers. So the MP can appoint any member of Lords, but its legislative power is limited to revision and delay. If I remember correctly, the House of Lords are only allowed to delay money bills for a year. Used to be 2 years. And the House of Lords is arguably less legitimate as they aren't democratically elected, and their version of Westminster Hall is the Grand Committee Room. So let's talk about backbench rebellions. So in the 50s and 60s there were no defeats in the Commons at all. But there were Conservative rebellions on the Maastricht Treaty between 1992 and 1993. There were a rebellion by 139 Labour MPs on the 2003 vote on invasion in Iraq. The coalition MPs rebelled in 35% of votes in the Commons between 2010 and 2015. The Conservative government between 2015 and 2017 lost EVEL, and Conservatives dropped tax changes in 2012 and 2015 because of fears of rebellion. So we have these two terms here. We have payroll vote, which is an MP that can be relied upon to vote in a specific way, and a lobby podder, which is someone that follows lobbyists. Also, a lot more rebellions since the whole Brexit thing has been going, so I'm not even, no. You may notice I'm brushing a lot of Brexit under the rug. Yeah. Reforming the House of Lords. So we have the White Paper in 2007, which proposed a hybrid House of 50-50 appointed and elected. We have the Free Vote in 2003, where Lords voted for a wholly appointed House, and MPs had to vote on 7 options, but none secured a majority. So a fully elected House of Lords would have legitimacy, but it would conflict with the House of Commons. What's the point in having 2 elected houses? What would be the difference between those two? But an appointed house has expertise and independence on cross-benchers. So Baroness Nietzsche in 2015 delayed cuts to tax credits, wanting more debate in the Commons. And the House of Lords Bill in 2012 was abandoned by the government after rebellions, but proposed a chamber of 360 elected, 90 appointed, and 12 bishops and 8 ministerial members. So, you know, there have been some attempts, but none have really worked. So let's look at the representation of the House of Commons and House of Lords. So in terms of ethnic diversity, BAME MPs rose from 41 to 52 in the 2017 general election, but still only 8% of the House, compared to 14% of the population. So in terms of age, most MPs are 35 to 55, and the youngest MP ever elected was only 20. Education, so 29% of MPs in 2017 went to fee-paying school, but only 7% of voters did, and 9 out of 10 MPs were university graduates, which arguably a good thing because they're more educated, arguably a bad thing because not everyone has a degree, so they're less in touch with the people. You make that decision. Sexual orientation, so 45 MPs in 2015 identified as LGB, not T interestingly, and that is the highest number worldwide. Well done, us. So in terms of female MPs, in 1983 only 23 MPs were female. In 2001 that went up to 118, in 2017 it was 208. So Labour produced the biggest increase due to all-women shortlist, and 73 candidates in 1983, but 256 candidates in 2017. Big rise for Labour. So 32% of MPs are women, but they make up 71% of the population. So there is an argument that we should be very accurately represented in order to be democratic, especially as views of women are often perceived as different to men, but women and men still agree, so does it really matter? So there was a proposed reduction of MPs to reduce to 600, which would obviously reduce representation as well. So the Lords are less whipped and so arguably more representative. First past the post is not proportional, and I mean, House of Lords, House of Commons, generally male, pale and stale. Not nice. Oh, lovely. So scrutiny, we have things like select committees. So these look in detail about how laws will work in practice, which gives more scrutiny than other methods like PMQs, due to more time and the fact that PMQs is more of a sort of press orientated thing. So people are called in to provide evidence, and they have to produce a report at the end, and it's across all parties in terms of the weighting of select committees are in line with the weighting of the House of Commons, if you get what I mean. So if the Conservatives have a majority in the House of Commons, they will also have a majority in the select committees. So we have things like the Liaison Committee, which holds the PM to account, the Home Affairs Committee, important Amber Rudd case there, didn't know about immigration targets and inadvertently misled Parliament. We also have the Public Accounts Committee, which is the oldest in the Commons and scrutinises value for money. So we have the Backbench Business Committee, or BBC. It was created in 2010 to give Parliament more power over the government and manages the e-petitions list. It meets one day a week, normally the Friday. Probably not a good thing that, because that's when most MPs are heading back home to do things with their constituents. But they do get definitive answers from ministers and government. So we also have the House of Lords Committee, which is incredibly thorough and looks at things like science and technology. The EU, the Constitution, but there are no departmental committees. So we have P&Qs, which I've already kind of talked about a bit. So they, PMs can prove themselves, or MPs can prove themselves, by putting forward ideas or scrutinising the opposite party. The leader of the opposition can ask 6 questions. All backbenchers get the chance to challenge the PM on any subject. It is televised, which arguably can increase scrutiny. But the PM does dodge questions, and questions are set up by members of her own party. Things like, does the Prime Minister agree with me that ... generally set up. And there is an application form, which generally means that there are loads and loads of people. Too much demand for the supply. So you also have questions to ministers, which are every day, that are written and oral, so there are more detailed responses, and they tend to be less chaotic than PMQs. I will also throw in a bit about John Bercow here. So he does a thing called urgent questions, which are controlled by the Speaker. He really loves the idea of getting backbenchers to speak, and he generally, I don't know, he just seems very fair in the way he does things. Right, this bit is going to be a bit wishy-washy, but we have core executive theory. So this is, the executive power is held in a complex and fluid web. So this includes PM in office, cabinet ministers, junior ministers, think tanks, senior civil servants, and independent policy advisors. In terms of Prime Minister's powers, we have responsible for government and government departments, direction of government policy, appointment, reshuffling, and dismissal of government ministers, leadership of the largest party, generally, in the House of Commons, national leadership and management of the cabinet, chairing its meetings and controlling the agenda. And this is affected by things like whether the party and the cabinet is united, lol, the popularity of the PM and their party, the personality and leadership style of the PM, strong and stable, and external pressures. So if we look at cabinet and cabinet government, so there are around 20 members of the cabinet, most are ministers. They're appointed by the PM, they coordinate the activities of the government departments and settle disputes. So policy is made democratically with each member carrying equal weight. So the Prime Minister is simply primus inter pares, so that shows growth of ministerial power. Appointment of political advisors, paid and appointed by party. Blair favoured a sofa government style. There's also the bypassing of cabinet committees, and collective responsibility, which is kind of also important. So we have Prime Minister and Prime Ministerial government, the idea of no individual mandate, the head of government, primus inter pares, the growth of Prime Ministerial power, and the PM dominates policy making in process of cabinet, and make sure that their own ideology is looked after. So let's check out some Prime Ministers whilst we're here. let's go straight to Thatcher. So, key enablers, things that really helped her. So, number 1, handpick ideologically supportive cabinet. Number 2, large parliamentary majorities. Number 3, the Falklands victory ran cabinet government. Cabinet government transformed her fortunes, boosting the chances of Thatcherism. Her own upbringing, the idea that she was sort of one of us, and also the divided opposition regarding the Westland affair, Northern Ireland, Kinnock, failed to bring her down. But we also have some limitations. So her style increasingly infuriated her own cabinet, so when she needed them they didn't necessarily support her. Policy of the poll tax was opposed by public opinion, lots of protests. So her authoritarian dominance eventually counted against her, bypassing cabinet, and 2 resignations of former chancellors, and that's not even to say anything about all of her really controversial policies. So she was brought down by her cabinet. She called it treachery. She planned to leave the government from the front. She was impatient with people who had different views. Her last cabinet grew unhappy, but you do have the Falklands War, where Thatcher felt the need for cabinet support at the end of this time, and reversion to cabinet government for the sake of war. Right, Blair. We have some enablers to him. Conservatives were tearing themselves up over Europe. What's changed? Strong sense of how to win elections. Bomb-proof manifesto. 3 objectives: joining the Euro, public service reform, and showing that a Labour Prime Minister can work with Republican President Bush. And the Northern Ireland peace protests. But there were some limitations. So he became accused of lying over the existence of weapons. He decided to go to war, which creates mistrust within the Labour government. MPs started to come against Blair on his agreement with the Israelis, and he announced that he wouldn't be the leader for the 2010 election, and his authority drained away. So 2 hours after the cabinet meeting, he went to the Millennium Dome despite opposition from the cabinet, which kind of shows that maybe he didn't really listen to his cabinet. So he made the Bank of England independent and didn't consider the cabinet and just said they'll agree. He expected ministers to bring up issues with him, to him, and not really by the cabinet. He was intent to run an executive power almost alone. Cabinet discussed, but Blair made the decision, and the meetings were only 30 minutes, so not a very long time considering complicated issues. So we're also looking at David Cameron, and you can see that for this one there is genuinely not a lot. Can you see that? There we go. So, David Cameron, the coalition lasted 5 years, which is kind of a good thing. The relationship with Osborne, Chancellor, was very good. Attempt to reform the NHS, fixed term Parliament Act, Big Society, the Equalities Act of 2010, all of these things worked well for him. But he had less experience than Blair. His coalition meant that 5 members of the cabinet were Lib Dem, so restrictions on what he could do. Phone hacking and other sort of scandals at that time. And then, of course, big one, Brexit. And genuinely, it doesn't really matter what David Cameron did. It's always going to be overshadowed by Brexit, I think. The man that ran away. So we have collective responsibility. Let's talk about that. So collective responsibility is when ministers must support cabinet decisions or resign from government. So in 2003, Robin Cook expressed concerns about the Iraq War and then resigned when he could no longer accept the collective responsibility for the decision. In 2016, Ian Duncan Smith resigned as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions at protest to cut disability benefits. Interestingly though, Cameron said that Smith had agreed to the cuts and the government had since agreed that they wouldn't go ahead. So, in 2009, James Purnell and Caroline Flint were critical of Brown's leadership. In 1979, James Callaghan's Labour government lost a vote of confidence. Bill Scottish Devolution was defeated in the Commons. So individual ministerial responsibility is that ministers are answerable to Parliament for all of their departmental activities, and they bear the consequence of any failure in administration, any injustice. So basically, recent example, Amber Rudd, the idea that Theresa May actually did the whole sort of Windrush generation thing, but Amber Rudd actually had to take the blame for it. That's individual ministerial responsibility. So some good things about it is that ministers are not civil servants and they can be held accountable. Ministers will and have resigned where error occurs. Doctrine underpins all scrutiny of ministers. It shows clear lines of accountability and ensures the civil service can still continue to offer confidential advice to ministers. But new freedoms have allowed ministers to blame individual civil servants, which undermines IMR. Much department work is carried by quangos and agencies, so blurred lines of accountability, questions competence and seems less important than the strength of the party overall, and suggests that ministers can be responsible for all departmental activity, which is kind of unlikely. So let's look at judicial independence. So this means that judges should be free from control of other branches of government. So the Constitutional Reform Act in 2005 enshrines judicial independence. We also have judicial neutrality, which is when judges act impartially and judgments are based on the law, not personal or political views. So this is when General Pinochet comes in. So you've got House of Lords should face prosecution, house arrest. Lord Hoffman's wife was chair of Amnesty International, so maybe not neutral, and the House of Lords takes itself to court. Yeah, interesting case, that one. So if we look at judicial reviews, this is good for democracy, arguably, because of transparency, but it is a takeover of parliamentary sovereignty. It now includes fairness, human rights cases, can hold government to account, and the Gina Miller case. So, let's talk about the Supreme Court. Now, Supreme Court are all over 60 and there's only one female and they're all white. That may have changed. So I suggest you Google that. I suggest I Google that as well after the video. So the Supreme Court and the Human Rights Act, so you have a 2015 case of Tiger arriving in the UK at aged 8. I assume I mean age 16, completed her A-level, oh yeah we go, age 6, she completed her A-level, couldn't get a student loan, she didn't have indefinite leave to remain in the UK, and it goes against her right to education, yada yada yada. Oh, there we go, that's it. I like how I finished with yada yada yada. That basically describes this entire topic. If I'm honest, I think this video is shorter than the other one, and that is for the pure and simple reason that in terms of this component, there isn't a lot in it that you already don't know from the first component, if that makes sense. So things like looking at elections. So the first component requires you to look at an election before 1997, the 1997 election, and one afterwards, so you kind of already get a sense of the cabinet and the government and style and stuff of how those prime ministers work by looking at those things. And in terms of pretty much everything else, you already sort of understand most of it from the first component. That's why there isn't really much in this component. So I would suggest, in terms of revising, make sure that first of all you are very competent on all of your component 1 stuff, and then things like select committees and devolution and things like that just add in, and then the rest of component 2 is sort of a bit, I mean it just links with component 1. There isn't really a lot that's new, if you get what I mean. You can do, I think we spent like a month on this before the exam or something, whereas we spent the whole time before that on component 1. So, if you've made it this far, congratulations. I'm very proud of you. Hopefully, we'll all ace this exam together. Good luck in your revision, and I'll see you guys later.